Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Dan Baer, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy Research here. For those of you who are visiting Washington this week, welcome. Welcome to Washington. We've turned the heat up a little bit for you just so you're comfortable. Sorry for the weather. But this is an exciting week for NATO, for the United States, and for all NATO allies. And we are delighted to have this program to kick off, which we're calling a Power Breakfast, on one of the most important topics, because one of the things about NATO is that as important as it has been for the last 75 years, the importance of making the case for NATO over and over again, including to so-called ordinary voters, remains a challenge for governments across the alliance. And I am thrilled to have a fantastic panel here today. I can tell you a backstory of each of the guests. First of all, Jim Sciutto is a longtime CNN journalist and colleague who has written a great new book that is timely and appropriate to today's conversation, The Return of Great Powers. I urge you to go out and buy it and read it. And thank you, Jim, for agreeing to moderate today. But each of these three people have a different backstory for how they got to this stage. I will start with John Hickenlooper, the senator from Colorado, and my former boss, because he has shown me that there's nobody who knows how to make the case for complicated things to ordinary voters like he does. Watching him in action going around the state of Colorado, talking about everything from climate change to education to how to create new jobs has been a lesson for me in politics. And so I expect that he can make the case for NATO as well as he can make the case for those things. Tobias Billström, the foreign minister of Sweden, this event in some ways came out of a conversation that we had last month in Stockholm, because one of the questions that we talked about together in our event there was how to make the case to Swedes, because Swedes are new members of NATO, how to make the case to Swedes for what this bold step that the government took in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what it means for them, their prosperity, and their security. And finally, Secretary Napolitano, who I confess I mean, we didn't know each other because I was a lowly DAS, but when we were colleagues in the Obama administration, I thought she must be crazy because she gave up being the governor of a great neighboring state of mine to take on what is possibly the hardest job in the federal government, being the Secretary of Homeland Security. It's a job where if you do it right, nobody will give you credit, and if you do it slightly wrong, everybody will blame you for everything, even the things that weren't your fault. And
I love that job.
See, and she's validating my claims. But she also was the former governor of Arizona, and so she's seen national security issues both from a state level and from a federal level, and then went on to be the president of the University of California system, which has a larger budget than, certainly a larger budget probably than the defense budgets of some NATO allies, and a larger budget than some states, I think, in the United States. So all three of these people have unique perspectives on how to make the case for NATO in this day and age. And I think yesterday's bombing of the Children's Hospital in Kyiv is a reminder that the threat that we collectively face from an aggressive Russia is something that is not going away anytime soon. It's something that we will have to learn how to manage for the medium term at least, if not the long term. And making the case for our collective security and prosperity is as urgent today as it was at the founding. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Jim to lead us through a conversation.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be on the stage with the three of you, and I appreciate you all taking time out of your morning. Senator, I want to begin with you, if I can. This is a friendly audience, the NATO Summit in Washington this week, to the argument that NATO is the key to security for Europe, for the US, and its allies. It's a friendly audience, but the fact is, in this country, there is a good 40% of the population, perhaps, however you measure it, who doesn't buy that. Close to half who doesn't buy that, partly, well, the result of a lot of things: divided politics in this country, success of some Russian disinformation, the comments of the Republican nominee for president. But my question is, from the side of Democratic leadership, President Biden, senators like yourself, has the pro-NATO voice failed to make the case to the American population at large that NATO is in its interest, that NATO is necessary, and that NATO is not a burden, a financial burden?
Well, I think we're seeing a flexure, a tipping point. For too long, most Americans took NATO for granted. And there's a level of collective amnesia. I think that's maybe a little bit too strong, but that's never stopped me in the past. But the lessons we learned in before World War II and what happens when you have autocratic regimes and dictators, when they're emboldened to continue to grow and acquire lands, to subjugate whole countries, there's a momentum that is hard to stop. And I think that's our job when I go, as Dan was saying, when I go around the state talking to people. I just spent the last couple of weeks going around parts of Colorado. People have forgotten that lesson, that you cannot allow these would-be empire builders. Right? In the old days, people would invade a neighboring country just because they ran out of food, and there was some real reason. That's not the case here. This is a question of the perception of their empire or their country's ego in a funny way. Anyway, as I talk to people around Colorado about the reality of NATO and how these 32 countries, now that we have 32 countries, how that makes every one of us stronger. And it is tied into our economy, our sense of security, which again, the optimism you need to have a strong economy comes from that security. It's a collective effort that pays huge dividends to everybody. It doesn't matter where you are in the state. And it's interesting, when I try to talk to everybody when I go around Colorado, in the rural areas, like most of our states, there are a higher percentage of Republicans, significantly. There's an age break, and older Republicans in rural areas, they don't have to be re-educated. They have a vivid memory of the circumstances before and during World War II and what that meant, and what World War II was like, and how horrendous it was for everyone. So I think we have to kind of relive that and make sure those stories get told again.
Governor, Madam Secretary, I don't know how to address you because you've had so many illustrious titles. What do you think is missing from the case made by President Biden, Democrats and Republicans who support NATO and believe that NATO is not only a values cause for the US, but a national security cause? What is missing from that message in terms of convincing more American voters that this is necessary?
I think with NATO, there's a kind of a golden sense of memory about World War II and what happened and the aftermath of World War II, when the majority of voters now didn't live during that era. This is ancient history. It's not just history; it's ancient history. And when you talk about young voters, that World War what? So. I think what's missing is to make the case about NATO's relevance now and for the future. And I like John's point, Senator's point, about the fact that in a world where there are empire builders, you need to be able to stand with your allies, your friends, against that untoward expansion of empire. But there are new security threats that affect the globe that are also relevant: cybersecurity, space, all of those where the United States position will be stronger if we are joined with our NATO partners.
Mr. Foreign Minister, being one of the newest members, the newest members of NATO, how did you make the case to skeptical Swedish voters that it was in Sweden's interest to join NATO? And I wonder, was fear the driving force, as being closer to the Russia threat, because we have the advantage of an ocean in between us? Was fear a key driving force?
Well, thank you. I will start by saying that I represent a country who decided at the end of the Napoleonic War to embark on a policy of being non-military aligned, and who maintained that policy for 200 years through the two world wars just mentioned, etc., etc., and then changed with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I would argue, however, that that change came about as a sequence. We started already in 1994 with entering into the Partnership for Peace. So the road towards the full membership was set. and working for some decades. But it's very true that the reason we shifted our policy was because we saw that Russia is on the move. Russia is trying to recreate its empire again at the expense of other states in our neighborhood. And being part of the great defense alliance that NATO represents is the only way for Sweden to create a space of safety and security for our population. And that was the case being put to the Swedish population, who responded in spring of 2022 in a very, very clear manner. Namely, if you look at the percentage ratio, we went within a few months from 20% approval ratio for NATO membership to 65%. Then we went even further. We now stand at 72%. That is the third highest ratio in Europe. Poland is at 91, the Netherlands is at 75, and we are at 72. And I think that there are reasons for this. We see what this means, not only for our safety as a country, you speak about the neighborhood, we also put this into the global context. Sweden has always believed in the multilateral system. We've always believed, since the end of the Second World War, in creating something to weigh up the great powers, because we are not a great power. We are a small country, and we realize this. And smaller countries doesn't have anything to say in a world where people like Putin or Xi Jinping dominates, because they think only in empires, and they believe that this is the right and proper way. Remember what Putin said to all of us? Dictators always have a tendency to be very clear and open, and nobody really wants to believe what they say. He said already in 2008 in the Munich Security Conference, peak diplomacy was the Vienna Conference after the Napoleonic War, where big countries in Europe sat down, carved out spheres of interests, telling others how to behave and where their places should be. And this was echoed in 2021, in December, when Sergei Lavrov sent his infamous letter to the world, saying that Sweden and Finland should never be allowed to join NATO. Yeah. So we see, coming back to your original question, the Swedish population saw with their own eyes what was happening, and they responded in kind.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar from Finland's experience, another country that made a strategic decision to be neutral to some degree that, of course, changed, given the threat. I absolutely agree with the rule, believe what they say, when it comes to the Putins and the Xis of the world, and the record of the last 20 years gives us a lot of evidence as to why to do that. If I can, Senator Hickenlooper, let's direct that rule to this country, because we have an election in November, you may have noticed. One of the candidates has said quite explicitly that he may not defend Eastern European allies in the event of a Russian attack. And by the way, we can't take that in isolation because, and I write about this in the book, during his administration, he very nearly brought the US out of NATO. And I know Congress has taken some moves to take that away from a unilateral decision by the president, but the fact is we know that if a commander-in-chief is not willing, or others believe the commander-in-chief is not willing to abide by Article 5, then Article 5 means nothing. Is it correct to say that NATO is on the ballot in this country in November?
To a certain extent, I think that simplifies it maybe a little bit too much. As a context, generally, Americans still have a positive feeling towards NATO. As long as you're not talking budgets, it's somewhere close to 80% of Americans think NATO is a good thing for our country. When you get into these expenditures in terms of Ukrainian invasion, they get more cautious because it's really a fiscal position. Article 5, the thing to remember, it's only been invoked once. Right. That notion that if one member of NATO was attacked, then everyone has to come to their aid. And that was the United States after 9/11. And Americans, when they hear that, there's a recognition that we are at risk and that this is an alliance that is very valuable to us. So in this election, there are going to be a lot of issues. I'm not even going to dare delve into the presidential election right now because it would be a distraction.
It's just around the corner.
It'd be an order of magnitude distraction. But I think that this will be part of that. Now, there'll be a lot of other things that are going to be discussed and compared, but NATO will come up again and again on whether we are willing to to maintain that commitment. And as you mentioned in the last funding bill for our defense, the NDAA, the Congress did make it illegal for a president to walk away from NATO.
They did, but to my point, I wonder what your thoughts are, Madam Secretary. A president may not then be able to officially walk away, but a president can, in effect, not just weaken it, but make that commitment meaningless by
sure.
refusing to enforce or abide by that commitment.
Or by using his bully pulpit to denigrate it and to keep, driving it down in American popular opinion. I mean, there's nuance here that is important. And, but back in the days when I was in electoral politics, one of the things I saw was that voters that I interacted with were not motivated by the international affairs. They were interested in the economy. They were interested in jobs. They might be interested in healthcare, education, but international affairs. But I think that goes to the point the senator made earlier, which is that NATO was almost taken for granted. And well, of course we're in this big alliance. We haven't driven home to people why we are in it, why it is important. And in American history, there is a natural isolationist trend because of our geographic location. We're not in Europe like Sweden is, and that comes into play too. But while I'm glad that the Congress put some language in the NDAA to prevent a unilateral withdrawal by a president from NATO, there are many tools in a president's toolbox that he can use to diminish the United States' presence there.
Yeah, it's remarkable how similar the rhetoric between the current America First movement and the late 1930s, 1940 America First movement, including the name itself, right? But the arguments were quite similar. Not our war, it's happening over there, et cetera. Yeah.
And remember, we didn't get into World War II until we were actually attacked.
Mr. Foreign Minister, difficult question for you. And I've asked this of a lot of foreign ministers, prime ministers in Europe. Do you have a plan for a NATO without US leadership? Because you might very well need one. And the security structure of Europe will be entirely different without, for instance, the reliability of the US nuclear umbrella. Do other countries in Europe go nuclear? I know you can't speak about it publicly because it's quite a sensitive issue, but would it not be a duty to, in your case, the Swedish public, to be coming up with a plan B?
Well, let me answer this question in sort of 3 steps.
Okay.
First of all, a NATO without the US is unthinkable. I think that has to be acknowledged. It's unthinkable because so much of not only the credibility in Article 5, but the whole structure of the alliance rests upon American presence. And we have to acknowledge this. And that brings me to step 2 or observation number 2, that the best way we can acknowledge this is by doing what we should do, namely to strengthen the European pillar in NATO by doing what we should have done many times before, namely live up to our commitments. See to it that we reach the 2% goal and regard this as a floor and not as a roof. Sweden is already doing this. We will this year reach 2%. We have already done it, and we consider this definitely as a floor and not as a roof. We will continue. I think we stand at 2.4 now in the calculations. And so we have to continue to do our part of the job. All members of the alliance, regardless of whether they are transatlantic or European, should do this. And the third thing is to recognize that the US also have security issues which are other than what we have, because after all, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is on the European continent. We also have to take into recognition the Indo-Pacific and the fact that that also should be recognized as part of NATO's, concerns, headaches, whatever you want to call it. And we believe that this is important. Sweden thinks that if you want a partner to be committed to what you feel is a problem, you have to show concerns and interest into that part of the world, which is the Indo-Pacific. The best way of doing this is to be practical about it. I don't think for a minute that the US wants European military presence. The US can handle this quite well, but they want political assistance. They want political recognition of the problem that China poses, also to our Indo-Pacific partners. And it is for this reason that Sweden is very much in favor of NATO opening a liaison office in Tokyo, for example. And we will work for that within NATO. And that is a commitment from the Swedish government. I've said this publicly before, but I'm going to repeat it again. If you want your partner to think about the things you think are a problem, you have to show commitment to their problems. And the American people are more concerned with the threat that China poses than Russia, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and it struck me how many European to Asia alliance connections have been made in the last couple of years, sharing of military technology, defense commitments from here all the way over here because of that shared sense that not just Russia is a threat, but China is a threat. Senator Hickenlooper, difficult question. NATO Summit is taking place during a week where some in the Democratic Party are questioning President Biden's leadership and his ability to carry on a presidential campaign. Where do you stand?
I think the president's made very clear that NATO is one of his highest priorities. And I think looking back at his many accomplishments, and I think it has been a remarkable presidency, his ability to rejuvenate is probably the best word, to bring NATO back together again and to create that resolve that we're going to push back against the Russian forces of invasion. If you're trying to get me to take a position on whether he should continue his campaign, I will collectively avoid answering the question just because right now it's a process of really listening. And most senators, and I think many House members have been in their home states trying to hear the broad array of opinions, which are of every single complexion. I don't think I've ever been in a more complicated political environment in my life. So it's probably not the right time for me to make news.
It is remarkable, though, to hear those, and it must be for you, to hear those questions 4 months out from a presidential election, and one that is described not just by the president, but by members of his party as a decisive one for the future of the American democracy.
You know, you can't choose as history comes over the transom as events take form that seem unbelievable at a certain point, but you have to adjust to them, and you can't bemoan the fact that these are difficult decisions, or this is not what I thought these are not the circumstances I thought I'd be dealing with. This is us. This is real. Right now, NATO's situation is absolutely real, and we're going to make the decisions we can, the best decisions possible with the information we have. And I have great confidence, whatever President Biden decides, that he'll do the right thing for the country. He's spent the last 50 years not worrying about himself, but always putting the country first. And I think that commitment is emblematic of America, right? That we're going to do what's best for world security and for NATO.
Secretary Napolitano, you have the advantage of being out of government now, so I can push you a little harder.
Good luck.
Should Biden be the Democratic candidate for president this year?
I think the question is not should, I think the question is will. And I think there's one person that makes that decision, and that's the president. And that is an intensely politically significant decision, obviously. It's a historic decision, obviously, but it's also a very personal decision. And it requires a level of introspection that none of us are privy to.
Right.
But the signals he's sending out now is he's the candidate, he's the nominee, he ran, he dominated the primaries, he's the nominee of our party. And if he ends up being the nominee of our party, we need to all make sure that we are pushing him into a second term, because to me, the real issue is which way does the United States go? Do we stay sort of moderate center left, or do we go to the the dark side, but to the far right. To me, the worst possible result would be the election of another term for President Trump.
Mr. Foreign Minister, you're a diplomat, so I'm not going to ask you the same question, but I am going to ask you how you plan in this environment, because the fact is, American elections, and let's be frank, not dissimilar from, say, French elections, right, or Polish elections in the recent cycle, that they move by the tiniest of margins, right, and by perhaps 40,000 votes in 3 swing states. Not just America's domestic policy, but its international policy could very well turn. So, and that's a dynamic that was shared in 2020 and 2016, and one might guess that it's going to be that way for a long time. It just must make it difficult from your perspective, because every 4 years you got to wonder, where is the U.S. in this? Is it going to go this way or is it going to go that way? You can't make national security policy around such swings, I imagine, right? How do you manage that?
Well, and yet this is exactly what you have to do.
Yeah.
Because every 4th year you do have elections, and you end up with results. First of all, it is the American people who elect their president, and we, as a member state of NATO, or as on a purely bilateral level, have to work with any administration that ventures into the White House, and it has always been like this. So that's a simple answer that we just have to accommodate. But I also would like to point to one thing, and I'm constantly saying this to people back home. We have a tendency to be too focused on the White House in both the media reporting back home and also in the perspective. There is also Congress. And one thing which I learned during the NATO process from all my travels and trips to the DC, and also all the incoming visits by senators and congressmen to Sweden, was how strong the commitment for NATO was among those people. Really strong, across the aisle. It didn't matter if it was Republicans or Democrats that you spoke to. They all believed very strongly in NATO. They viewed Swedish membership extremely, in extremely positive terms, and said, things which I think means that we have to think about a Congress which will be, an interesting, I wouldn't call it a counterweight, but I would say that it has always been like this in the US system. Yeah. But it has always been like this with the rest of the world, but we focus too much on the president in the White House because it's too easy to do it, while the Senate is, much more fragmentized and difficult to understand.
And you could be surprised, right? Because
and I'm sitting next to a senator, so I'm looking at
You're welcome to respond. You're welcome to respond. One thing, I want to go to questions from the audience, but I made the mistake of leaving the iPad in the green room so I can get questions from you, which I will do momentarily. There we go. As I peruse the list of questions, Senator, on the case of kitchen table issues, right? I saw this from many in the Republican Party while Ukraine aid was still being debated in Congress. That these reminders that 80% of the funds actually come back to the U.S. because these weapons systems are made here in these countries, and a lot of jobs dependent on that. The truth is, though, it's not just a financial kitchen table question, right? Because I often try to explain this to folks when I'm giving talks that, can you open an office for your company in Eastern Europe or in China reliably and safely, under the rules-based international order, which sounds boring? You can, right? Can your child study abroad in Eastern Europe or Asia, right? Like that there are benefits to the rules-based international order and NATO and a kind of world that is not run by might makes right. Who's making that case to the American people?
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
And you're right that we are, for a good while, we've been entering this global economy whereby so much of the benefits we enjoy in this country are the result of having successful businesses with global reach. And the relationship with Sweden and all the NATO countries is only part of that. People in rural Colorado who, let's say, they're working on a farm and doing what they've done for decades, they're in some way insulated from that, and it's not directly there, but they're fully aware of it.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed when I was up having on 4th of July, went up and had breakfast with a remarkable farmer in Colorado named Keith Bath, who I've known for a number of years. And he's fully aware of what the global markets are and the war in Ukraine, what that does to commodity prices and for crops. I mean, this isn't as removed from those kitchen tables as we sometimes think. And as our economy becomes more global, so does our consciousness to a certain extent. Again, there's a little bit of a lag there. But I think just as we took NATO for granted, we sometimes take this global economy for granted. And yet when all of a sudden it's put into sharp focus that this is something we can lose and is at risk, suddenly people snap to attention. And I think there'll be a shift in sentiment.
Yeah, we do have I think there's a tendency to underestimate voters. Right?
Exactly.
No question. I mean, even if you look at the situation in France, I mean, there were voters who understood the kind of choice that they were making. You have the advantage of having run for elective office in a swing state, right? in a swing
Just
state.
south of Colorado, yeah.
Did you find greater awareness of these issues than us in this Washington bubble give the rest of the country?
Yeah, I think the senator has it right, that where the issues get translated into something tangible that voters live in or appreciate, they understand it. And in sectors of the economy like agriculture, which are inherently global in nature, there was a very good understanding of how the United States was situated in terms of the international market structure. So I agree, voters are much more tuned in. They're tuned in a different way than, say, the Beltway. Their lens is different than the punditry, but they are tuned in.
So I'm going to begin with some questions from the audience. One here, and this is to your point, Mr. Foreign Minister, leaders of Korea and Japan are here for the NATO Summit, Asian participants. Although Koreans and Japanese want good Japan-Korea relations, the idea of the Korean-Japan alliance is a highly controversial topic that may backfire, deteriorate Japan-Korea relations. How can we convince the public of the idea of a U.S.-Japan-Korea partnership and alliance? I suppose, the question here is that you don't just have NATO skepticism in this country, you have alliance skepticism. And Trump has expressed skepticism not just about NATO, but about U.S. forces in South Korea, the alliance with Japan. I suppose the point is that this is a global question. It's not just the U.S. position and role in Europe, but globally. And do you worry about a retreat from potentially all alliances, not just the NATO alliance, from the U.S. perspective?
Well, referring back to my previous answer, I think that U.S. participation in global affairs is indispensable. That's the view of the Swedish government. We need to have the U.S. at the table in order to get things done. And this is the way we will be working with the administration with that goal. But having said this, just harking back to the question of Indo-Pacific, well, at the same time, you have the AUKUS. You mentioned Japan and South Korea, but you also have Australia and New Zealand. I think that we should, once again, come back to the fact that we need to have partners, we need to have allies, and that goes for the US as well. Yeah. And I think that if you are going to stem the constant infringement of China upon sovereign states in the Indo-Pacific, you need to work with the partners who are already there. And that's the four ones I mentioned, the IP4, but also other countries as well. I think that we should reach out to countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, even Vietnam, because they also feel the breath of China down their necks. Perhaps it's not time at all to withdraw from old alliances or old allies. It's time to find new ones.
Senator, it strikes me that it is under-discussed and under-reported the nuclear implications of a U.S. withdrawal or step back, in that if the U.S. were to either formally leave NATO or effectively do so, European nations might very well make a security decision to go nuclear, right? I mean, there's been discussion of this. You can see a similar calculation by South Korea and Japan. And then going onward, Saudi Arabia, right, in relation to an Iran threat. One, I'm curious how concerned you are about the threat of nuclear proliferation if you have that retreat. But two, I wonder if that might be a way to convince American voters that's another reason to be involved, right? It's a less safe world in that environment.
It's certainly a point worth discussing, and I think it does get people's attention, and I think it is a real risk. I think you begin to destabilize the status quo, and you're actually instigating the kinds of thoughts and discussions that will lead some countries to go in a nuclear direction. I think you also have to look at this. I mean, so certainly when I was a kid, we'd have nuclear raid training, and we'd have to go in our schools, leave our classrooms, sit in the hall. Now we're going to have cybersecurity training, right? And so it's not just nuclear. When we destabilize or step back from our alliances in the modern world and forget about, artificial intelligence just for a moment, but cybersecurity, we're being attacked every single day. And Secretary Napolitano could go into more detail than any of us would wish, I'm sure. But this is real. Yeah. And we need these alliances. It's not just nuclear proliferation. It is the emboldening the attacks that come from mostly, I think, from Russia, but also from Iran and from North Korea, all kinds of places that are bent on our destruction and attacking our economy. In other words, really trying to think of pirates, modern-scale pirates.
Why doesn't that message get through? I wonder, because you do. I mean, you have a view in this country, which I genuinely believe is not true, that the threat from Russia is exaggerated, right? Russia are friends. By the way, it was NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And here you have a country that has made a strategic decision to undermine the U.S., to weaken the U.S. and its alliances, and to weaken Europe, and is attacking via cyber means. It's weaponizing space. I mean, you know all these threats, and yet in this country you have a whole host of people in the Republican Party who try to claim, well, you exaggerate the threat, Russia is our friend, and missing all the direct evidence to the contrary.
These are unanswerable
What do you do?
But I think we should not forget Russia's direct involvement in our electoral process.
Yeah.
And they did it in 2016. They probably did it before 2016. They're very knowledgeable about the psyche of the United States voter. They've been at it for a long time. And they know how to precisely target different messages to different communities. Yeah. And there's nothing to suggest they haven't been at it in 2022 and 24. And that should be viewed as a direct threat to our nation. I mean, our democracy, how we conduct ourselves. The thought that it's being partially manipulated by an outside state actor ought to give us all a step back. But unfortunately, that message has gotten now conflated into partisan politics. Yeah. And if you say Russia interfered, the immediate thing is, no, they didn't, the election was stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And we've lost sight of what's really going on.
Yeah, it's become a case where if it's for our side, all is fair, right? And Trump said that from the Oval Office. He was asked, I think it was by George Stephanopoulos, that, if you got information from another country against your candidate, and he said, well, I'd accept that, right? I mean, it's basically inviting interference,
right?
Which is a remarkable new reality,
right?
Right.
And the United States is not the only target of this kind of interference. I mean, this is an international phenomenon where open and free democratic societies are involved.
All over Europe. I don't have to tell you that because you experience it every day in your politics, as do NATO allies there. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to that kind of interference in your politics and your elections? Are you better at it than we are?
Well, to my mind, and all the information that I have, we have good resilience against this in Sweden. That's what our authorities tells us, both the recent election to the European Parliament and before we haven't seen any major attempts to disrupt or disturb. But you cannot rule out that in the future. And yet, it's very clear, especially in not the recent but previous French elections, that there were attempts made by Russia to try and influence them. And the UK has also made the same allegations. And yes, you do also have parties within certain countries of the European Union where there are clear connections with Russia. And what you have to do is, as always, try to win the democratic case by being open, by talking, by showing transparency. And I think that it is by this resilience that our democratic institutions have that we will be able to overcome this. At the end of the day, you can try to launch bot armies and try to convince people via that. But I think it's a problem. However, I see some cases where you can really see that the countries which you mentioned, not only Russia, but also China, Iran, and North Korea, are grouping together in order to disrupt things.
100%.
And we saw that with the campaign directed at the Swedish social services, the so-called LVU campaign, that's the acronym for the Swedish, part of the Swedish social security system, where we saw that Iran tried to make the case that Swedish authorities were kidnapping children of Muslim families. Yeah. This is, of course, complete rubbish. There has never been any such things going on. But that campaign were built on original cases where people had been, in conflict with the social services, were then shared millions of times on the internet. It is a campaign still running. And the attempt is to try and disrupt the Muslim population in the Swedish society and turn it against Sweden. And of course, Iran has a clear interest in doing this. And you can also see that a country like Russia helped Iran by the sharing through their cyber network. So we have to understand that they will try to find weak spots in our societies and explore them. And we can only prevent this by acting together and by joining hands in the free world. And if we don't do that, well, they will pick us off one by one, of course. And countries in Eastern Europe are also experiencing attempts by Russia to influence their elections in the same manner as I spoke about before.
Yeah, and it's so quick. I mean, yesterday with this attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, I tweeted about it, and already some of these accounts come back and say, well, there was a weapons store next to the Children's Hospital, which is not true, but it's a great way to just kind of, and by the way, they don't even have to win the argument, they just muddy the waters. It's classic, like Soviet
seed,
propaganda,
right? Yeah,
100%,
seed, yeah.
which is happening in this country every day. There's a question here about President Biden's priorities as relates to Ukraine. One, making sure Russian aggression against Ukraine does not succeed, and two, preventing a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Do you believe, and I'm curious if the others believe, that this administration has been too concerned about number two, and therefore slow-rolled Ukraine's support to the point where help them defend but not win?
You're asking me?
I'll start with you.
I was afraid of that. No, I think that's a balancing act, and I think you phrased it correctly. I think Biden's approach has been measured and cautious, but at a certain point, you're putting Ukraine in a position where they're continually being attacked without being able to push back. And in some way, conflict is the disalignment of self-interest. In other words, Russia has everything to gain by bombing Kyiv again and again, and really very little at risk. And I think that at a certain point, there's got to be a consequence to that. Yeah. And I don't think you want to start out there. I think we want to see that measured response, and that we tried to do everything we could to restrain Russia, to push them back, to make sure that they don't succeed. But you can't leave Ukraine just to be, randomly, relentlessly bombed without being able to fight back.
Yeah, we're seeing that. Another question that's dominating discussion this week, if I could direct to you, Mr. Foreign Minister, is does Ukraine actually have a future in NATO, or is this just talk? Because for instance, when I was researching the book, publicly, the answers would be path, we'll get there, we're committed, whatever it takes to win, all that kind of stuff. Privately, I would hear, I don't see how we do that. What's the reality?
The reality is that Ukraine definitely has a future in NATO as a full member. And I think it is, it is inevitable, but this is the way we're going to end up. Whether you use the term an irrevocable path or whatever, the path is very clear forward. And this has to do with the fact that it is the only way to prevent, after, a peace negotiation. It is only Ukraine that can decide when that comes about, but when it comes about, and with the outcome, the only way of preventing Russia from ever attacking Ukraine again is by bringing it into the alliance. And I think we will be able to do that. There will be a process. But I mean, I say this without any kind of irony or sarcasm, but if you look what Ukraine will bring to the table, they will bring the most war-experienced and perhaps best equipped army in Europe at the moment. So I mean, from the point of fulfilling the actual military commitments, there's not going to be any discussions. There will be other discussions. And I think that this is all well and good. I think this is the way it should be. And you should allow every country to decide which, in accordance with the open door policy, to decide their security solution. Actually, what brought Sweden and Finland into the alliance was that we exercised our right to decide what kind of security solution we would have, which is actually the basis of the entire, not only European security order, but also the world security order. So I think that we should stand up for Ukraine's right to walk this path. That doesn't mean that there is, that you don't have to fulfill commitments. Of course you have to do, but you should be allowed to walk the path, definitely.
That's always my answer to the question when I'm asked, or the argument is made to me that, NATO expanded into Eastern Europe, or why did NATO push up on Russia? So I say, well, ask the Swedish or the Finns, or ask the Estonians, right? Ask them why they chose via democratic process to join, and it's a survival issue, right? In the words of some.
Exactly. It is never NATO that expands. It is always individual states that, for historical reasons or reasons of present day, makes the decision to join the alliance. And that should always be repeated. There is no sinister conspiracy bringing countries into the NATO family. It is always individual decisions by countries.
Because we live in an age of doom and gloom, some justified, I'd like to end forums like this with what gives you hope, and perhaps I could begin with you and then just move down the line before we end. We got a couple minutes left, but what gives you hope during this week of the NATO Summit, but this quite crucial year for this country?
Well, two things. One is I'm delighted the NATO Summit is happening in this country in this year, because I think it gives a great opportunity to refresh in people's minds why NATO, why now, why it matters. And in terms of our own domestic political situation, my message of hope is that American voters should never be taken for granted. You have to earn their votes, and they are an amazingly resilient people. And so we're going to have a tumultuous election. We already are. One party will win, one party will lose, but the country itself, our bones are strong.
That's nice to hear. Mr. Foreign Minister?
Well, thank you. Well, we definitely live in very interesting times, as they say. And I can only, again, repeat that we are joining NATO, leaving behind a 200-year-old policy of being a non-military aligned country. You don't do that very lightly. We do it because it is necessary to do it. But having said this, the fact that we are doing it also shows our confidence in the alliance. And what gives me hope is the fact that the alliance shows, being the most successful alliance in world history, that there is hope for the future. If we stand together, joined, we will come through this. If we don't do it, well, we should hark back to the words of Benjamin Franklin, If we don't hang together, we will all hang separately.
Well quoted. You get the final word, Senator.
I guess I'd go right back to Churchill, if we're going to be quoting famous thinkers, that you can always count on the United States to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possibility. And I feel that way about our political system. I think this is going to be, I mean, any of us who've been in elected office, pretty much every 2 years it's the most important election of our lifetime. Yeah. I don't have to say that to anyone. Everyone knows that. There's an awareness, and in a funny way, it's inspiring. And I feel optimistic that we're going to come out of this stronger. A lot of that complacency and taking our success for granted and not really examining our values and understanding how we got where we are. This next 4 months is going to allow us to go deep in that at a level that we haven't seen in a long time. And I think those kitchen tables in communities all across America are going to be very busy. A lot of conversations. And for a while there, it was so people wouldn't talk politics because they were just so worried about getting into a fight. And now, literally in the last month, I've heard more and more people saying, well, we have to be able to discuss this and really talk about the differences and where can we find that alignment of self-interest that creates cooperation and collaboration and all the things that create success. Yeah. So I'm optimistic.
One more Churchill quote, and this is one that the Estonian Prime Minister frequently has said to me and others, is an appeaser is one who feeds the crocodile expecting to be its last meal, which he quotes in relation to Putin, but of course conscious of history of the 1930s and 40s. Anyway, many thanks to the three of you and to all of you. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very much.